You don't know me, I'm Beth. I've been coming to this church for nearly 3 years now. And on a Sunday morning, you'll often find me over on the other side with our kids. So I'm kind of hoping that you might have a slightly long attention span, because this is going to be a bit longer than 5 minutes. But forgive me if any bits of this sound a little bit more like story time or kind of chatting to the kids, because that's where I usually am on a Sunday. And this week, we're continuing in our series of Acts. So we're coming into the kind of later chapters and going to be looking at waiting well and what we can learn from Paul during a phase of his life that looked a bit different in Acts 23 to 26. So up until now, Paul's life has been a lot of traveling, a lot of moving around, a lot of spending time with people in the early church, and a lot of teaching. But actually, in this phase, his life looks a lot different, and he is waiting on a decision from other people. So before we really dive in, I'm just going to quickly pray. Lord, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for always loving us and always being present throughout our lives. And I pray that you give me the words to say that you want the church to hear this morning. And I pray for you to open everyone's ears to hear what you need them to hear this morning. Amen. So this week covers 4 chapters of the Bible, which I'm not going to read all of that to you because I think I'd have no time left to actually talk about it if I did. So instead, I'm going to show a quick snippet of a video that kind of summarizes these 4 chapters. So I really love those videos. If you haven't seen those series, I really recommend them if you want kind of an overview of total books of the Bible. But as we saw in that video, Paul is waiting for years of his life for a decision to be made that just keeps being passed over and passed over and passed over to different people. And it might feel like, because he's done nothing wrong, and actually that is the end conclusion, that that's wasted time. But actually it's not, and waiting is never wasted time. Actually, it's really important. It's a really important part of the journey. It's important for giving us the skills and building us to the future plan that God has. And when I was preparing for this preach, God reminded me of the sign that was above the door of the church that I grew up in. I haven't thought about this sign for quite a while, so I really felt like God was guiding me that actually that sign was kind of what we needed to hear today and hear from this preach. So I think there's a picture of this is what the church I grew up in used to look like. It doesn't actually look like that, and the sign is no longer there. But when I went to the church, this was the sign. So it says, "Here to love God and people." So we are all here, and that here is different for each of us, but we are here in this place that God has placed us for a reason, and that whilst we're here, his greatest command for all of us is to love God above anything else and to love people. And that applies in easy times, and it applies in challenging times, and that is that command for us over our lives in all periods. So I'm going to split that into 3 sections, and we're going to start by looking at here and being here. So we saw in the video, Paul's life looked very different. So my view of Paul and kind of when I think of him is he's someone that loves being on the road, traveling, moving from place to place, that he loves being surrounded by people in the early church, that he loves to kind of see things progress and develop and see that church grow, and that he was very used to seeing God's promises fulfilled kind of in the early church and within his life. But that's not where he is in this place. He's not on the move. He's stuck wherever he is told to be at that point, so that moves a few times, but he is not in control of the physical place he is. He's not surrounded by loads of people. Actually, his social circle becomes very limited through this time. And he's not really seeing things progress. Actually, it's probably very repetitive, having to reappeal to new courts and new leaders all the time. So he's probably feeling quite stuck in this repetitive cycle. And he's also not seeing progress towards the promise he has from God that he will end up in Rome. So his life looks very different. And this isn't a really short time. This period lasted for years of his life. And the world sometimes tells us that we should manifest, if we manifest, it will come true. That we deserve things, that we deserve our dreams to come true, or we deserve success. But actually, what God says and what he says in the Bible, that's not it. He doesn't say that we're going to get everything that we've ever wanted. In Matthew 16:24, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life will find it." He's not saying our dreams are all going to come true. He's saying the opposite, something that's probably much harder for us to digest and accept. But he's actually saying that we need to hand our dreams, hand our visions for our life over to him. That we need to give him those dreams that we have for our lives. And sometimes God's plan for our life might equal what our plan for our life was. But sometimes it won't. Sometimes what we've visualized, what we want, what we dream for, doesn't equal what God is planning for our life. And in this phase of Paul's life, I can't imagine he's overjoyed to be sitting there waiting in captivity. And I'm not saying it's easy. Actually, it can be incredibly difficult to kind of take those things that we've dreamt of and hand them to God. And sometimes that might involve us having to go through a phase of grieving for those dreams or processing that. Because as we hand them over, we don't know whether God is going to fulfill them or whether actually he has something else. But he always has something better for us. So in handing over our dreams, we just need to remember that he has something better. And whether we see that on this earth or actually we have to wait until we see him face to face in heaven and we're all consumed by his overwhelming perfect love. He has better for us. He has a better dream for us. He has a better plan for us. And he has put us in the season that you are in right now for a reason. Whether this season is exactly how you imagined and always wanted your life to be, or looks absolutely nothing like it. Whether this season's for a really short time or a really long time. Whether you have promises from God that you're hanging and clinging onto, or whether actually you don't know what he's planned for your life. You are still here for a reason. And if you're struggling in this phase that God's put you in, the one thing I really want you to hear this morning is that God has not forgotten you in this phase. God is no less faithful when we're struggling, when we're waiting. He's no less present. He's no less loving. He's no less powerful in the phases of waiting or difficulty than he is in phases of progress or times that are easy. And we can choose how we react to these situations. There are many ways which we can react. We might choose to bury our feelings, bury everything of the situation, or do the opposite and overshare how we're feeling to everyone we come across. We might complain about it all the time, or we might try and ignore it and actually bury it and distract ourselves and not really pay attention. But to really wait well, the best thing that we can do is be honest with God. To be honest with him about how we're feeling, but not forgetting the faith in that we have in God's love and his plan. Being honest with him doesn't mean that we're denying that faith. It's also not about trying to change God's mind or trying to persuade him around to our way of thinking or try and get that plan that we wanted. But by being honest with God, we build our relationship with him. We strengthen that relationship with him. And actually, we might come to understand more about God's plan for our lives, or at least coming to terms with when things don't look quite how we expected them to. So then, looking at the second part of that sign, to love God. So in Matthew 37 to 39 is where the verse that this sign kind of comes from. And that says, so Jesus says in this verse, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So waiting is not an absence of God. Even when he seems like he's quiet, he's not absent. And God's omnipresence and always being there is really well documented across the Bible. There are many, many verses that I could choose about this. So a few that kind of stood out to me is in Joshua 1:9. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. In Psalms 23:4, it says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And then in Isaiah 43:11, it says, then you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. And honestly, there are many, many more verses that I could have chosen. Actually, there's so many in here to always remind us that that those times of waiting, those difficult times, they're not God's absence. He is there. He is with us through those difficult times. And within the passage of Acts that we're looking at today, in Acts 23:11, Paul hears the Lord saying, it says, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. So even within this passage, we see God saying to Paul, I'm with you. He's standing there with him. So God is protecting. God is there. He's present. But he's actually actively present. He's not just passively kind of there. He's actively present, protecting Paul through this period of his life. And I'm just going to read a section from Acts 23 that kind of is a really good demonstration and shows God protecting Paul through this stage of his life. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petitioned the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets it. But when the son of Paul's sister heard this plot, he went to the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, what is it you want to tell me? He said, some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give it to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request. The commander dismissed the young man with this warning, don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me. Then he called 2 of the centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen, and go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. So whilst a huge group of people actually decided to create a plot against Paul, a plot to take his life with a real level of commitment that they were not eating or drinking until this happened, God provided protection from Paul. He provided protection in the form of his nephew overhearing and going and telling the message, but he was actively present, protecting him through this time. And Paul had a promise from God that he would make it to Rome, that he could cling on to through this time. He knew that he wasn't there yet, so was probably not going to die now, because how otherwise would he get there? But even with that promise and the really strong faith that Paul had, I still think that a threat on his life would have been a scary and difficult time to go through. But God delivered Paul safely to Governor Felix. He delivered him through this and protected him through this stage of his life. But some of you here might be thinking, oh, well, he had a promise that he could cling to, so that made it easier. But actually, trusting in God is not just for when we have the promise that we're going to make through. And one example from the Bible that there is that I really find useful and helpful in showing how to trust in God through difficult times is about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel. So King Nebuchadnezzar commanded everyone to worship a gold statue. And if they didn't, the punishment was to throw them into the furnace. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused. They knew that worshipping the gold statue, worshipping an idol, went completely against God's teaching. So they refused, and they were thrown into the fire. But Nebuchadnezzar was really angry, so they weren't just thrown into the normal furnace. They were actually thrown into a furnace that was 7 times hotter than it should have been. And it was so hot that the soldiers that were throwing them into this furnace died. But despite that, we still see God's protection in this story. In Daniel 3:24-27, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. God provided a miraculous and really visible protection for them while they were in this furnace. They didn't know that God was going to see them through this. They didn't know that they were going to survive this fire, but they chose to trust in God anyway. And we know that they didn't know, because in verse 17-18, it says, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." They knew God was able to protect them and for their lives to continue after the fire, but he didn't know whether he would see them through that. They didn't know whether that was going to be the end of their lives. But they made a choice, and I think this is really key. Trusting in God is a choice. It's a choice we have to make every day, every minute of every day. It's not something that just happens. They chose, even if obeying God and not worshipping that gold statue was going to result in their death, they still chose to trust in God through that time. And there's 2 reasons that I really like this example of God's protection. The first is that God didn't prevent them from going into the fire. Sometimes God doesn't block and prevent us from going through difficult things and going through hard things. But God was present, and God protected them through that experience. Just as God is present with us as we go through difficult times, as we go through times of waiting, and he protects us through those times. He never leaves us. He protects us and provides for us. He provides us comfort, and he gives us strength through those times. The second reason I like this story is the visible nature of God's protection. The fact that Nebuchadnezzar saw a 4th person there, that actually it helps me to kind of, I guess, process and understand what God's protection can look like. That actually the idea of having someone physically there protecting us. But just as God's protection and his presence is active, so is our waiting. God asks us to wait actively, not passively. And above everything else, that active waiting, God's command is for us to love him. So that brings me on to the third point and the third section of that sign, which is to love people. So looking at the second half of Matthew 22, 37 to 39, is love your neighbor as yourself. That's God's second command. And we see throughout Paul's life, once he's a Christian, how much he is focusing on other people, how much of his time he spends focusing on others, not on himself. And the primary and most common way we see him do this is through prayer. So within this passage, we see him pray for those people who are keeping him in captivity. In Acts 26 to 29, he says, "Short time or long time, I pray that God not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become who I am, except for these chains." And by become who I am, he's meaning for them to become Christians, for them to have faith in God, with a bit of added sense of humor around not with the chains, which I quite like to see. But we see this isn't the only time we see Paul stepping out. First action is to pray. Actually, the vast majority of the letters that he's written start with prayer. In Romans 1, verse 8 to 10, we see him say, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is becoming reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now, at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you." And in Philippians 1, verse 3 to 4, we see him say, "I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy." There's kind of two things that stand out to me here. The first is that's chapter 1 of both books. That's not halfway through that he prays for them and thanks God for them. It's not at the end. It's right at the very beginning. The second thing that stands out to me is the language he used. So the word constantly and the word all my prayers. This isn't a one-off for Paul. It's not an occasional thing. It's ongoing and it's frequent, his prayer for others. And I definitely think that it's a challenge for us. It's definitely a challenge for me of actually the first thing to turn to when trying to love other people and help other people is to pray for them. Sometimes it can be easy, I think, to forget or to try and move straight to things that seem a bit more like practical ways of loving them. But actually, prayer is an incredible way to show love for our friends, for enemies, for neighbors, for strangers. And it's the most powerful and the most loving thing that we can do for someone, is to pray for them. After prayer, God might lead us to act in other ways, which will look different for each situation and for each of us in how to love people. For Paul, his greatest legacy was the letters that he wrote to the early church. Letters of encouragement to help them through difficult times and to help them continue to grow the church and just generally encourage them in their faith. But these haven't just helped the people who were in the church at that time. We still read them now. They've encouraged generations of Christians and will continue to encourage generations more. Paul was really unlikely to know that level of impact that came from him listening to God and following the guidance and following God's direction for him to write those letters. And whether any of those letters were written within this specific time of waiting or not, which is a little bit disputed, it still shows us how Paul really focused on other people through his own times of difficulty and his own times of waiting. And sometimes what the fulfillment and kind of where things go, we don't know that full impact. We also don't fully know what it might look like. So whilst Paul did have a promise of where he was going, he didn't get there in the way he expected. He didn't get to Rome in the way that he would have visualized, and I won't spoil too much for next week. But that journey and how things end and how our periods of waiting and the impact they have, we don't necessarily know what it's going to look like. It might look a little bit different to how we expect. Like, I know many people here are waiting for this evening, feel like we've waited for ages for the Euros and waited finally for England to win. But let's not forget we did win 2 years ago. The team might just have looked a little bit different to how you expected with the Lionesses winning. But regardless of the result tonight, regardless of whether we win and there's that great celebration that realistically is probably going to be short-term joy, God has something better for us. The end of God's plans are better than us winning the Euros. Whether it's the men's team or the women's team, there is better for us. So, moving on from football. With loving people, it's actually proven, and we can see in research, that spending time helping others benefits our mental health. It reduces anxiety, it reduces stress, it helps people to have higher self-esteem, to feel greater kind of purpose. And I don't think it's a coincidence that something that God instructed us to do, the God who created us and created our minds, benefits our minds and has a positive impact on us. So if the band would like to start coming back up. Whilst I think it is really important, and it is really important for us to look up and look out, particularly in times when we're struggling ourselves, to not focus on ourselves, but to look out and focus on other people. I do want to stress that if you are in a difficult time and feel like you need help and support, we need to not forget our own needs. And if you feel like you don't have the places to turn to, then please reach out to the Connect team at the end, and that the church is here to encourage and to support. Even Jesus surrounded himself with friends. And so, as Jesus is kind of our template of how to live life, and he surrounded himself by friends, so should we. In Hebrews 10, verse 23 to 25, it says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the days approaching." It's important for us to love one another and to be loved by one another. It's important to encourage each other, to meet together and make sure that we continue to do life together. Ultimately, we are all waiting. Whether you feel like you're specifically in a phase of waiting in life or not, we are all waiting for Jesus to return or to be taken to heaven. And so we can all learn from how Paul dealt with waiting, and we can all learn from Matthew 22 that we're here to love God and love people. We're here right where God has placed you, to love God above everything else and to love people. And if you feel stuck, it's not about what you want God to do. It's about rephrasing that and rechanging our focus of thinking about what God wants us to do. To be here in this very place that God has put us, to love God above everything else and to love people. So as we come to an end, I just want us to spend a few minutes in individual prayer, being really honest with God about how we are feeling in this time. To tell him how we're feeling, to connect, to tell him how much we love him and be thankful for him, and to hear from him on how we can help and love others. So I'm just going to go silent for about a minute, and then for everyone to pray themselves, and then I will end in prayer. Lord, I thank you that you've placed each one of us in this place for a reason. I thank you that your plan for us is better than we can ever imagine. That even when we're struggling or going through difficult times, that your plan is better. Lord, I thank you that you are always present, even when we might not be hearing from you. That we can rely on your presence. That we can trust in your protection, that you provide what we need. That you'll comfort us through difficult times and strengthen us when we need it. I thank you that your love is never ending, that we can rely on you. And I pray for you to help us to love you more, to rely on you more, and for us to love other people, that we will turn to prayer first, that we will pray for others, whether we know them or not, whether they're our close ones or people we struggle with. Lord, I pray we listen and we hear when you want us to act. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for being with us through everything. Amen.